From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Though Robert Burns is most commonly known as Scotland's national poet, he also made a significant impact in the United States of America during the late 18th and 19th centuries. In this lecture, Dr. Sood discusses the complex, layered, and multifaceted cultural memory of Robert Burns in the United States of America from 1800 to 1900. Please join me in welcoming Arun Sood.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I also want to begin by paying my debts to the people and the institutions who have enabled me to undertake the research that I'm going to present here today. In particular, the staff and everyone associated with the Kluge Center. As Travis mentioned, this is actually my second stint here. I was here during my PhD. And I can't overstate how helpful it has been, both in terms of my own research and also my career development, and also through collegial bonding, in the sense that I've made some great friends here, friends for life, some of who are in the room, and some who are in different parts of the world. So to Travis, to Mary Lou, to Dan, to everyone associated with the Kluge Center, I just want to say a big thank you. I'd also like to thank the Fulbright Commission for facilitating this particular research trip. I feel very lucky to be part of a program that is centered around cultural exchange, particularly when we live in an age where exchange between different people from different places, different cultures, different countries is so vital. And I hope that some of my research into Scotland and America's historical literary connections gives back at least a little bit to a programme that seeks to enhance understanding between cultures. Part of the pleasure of working here at the Kluge Centre is working with such a broad range of scholars in a confined space. I'm sure the Kluge Fellows who are in the room would agree that when you have the likes of an astrobiologist, a historian of religion, political scientists, a film director, working all in a very small space, it makes for a very stimulating research environment and you get some great conversations. Equally, however, I realise that there will be varying degrees of familiarity and also interest in the subject of my talk today. The 18th century poet and song collector, Robert Burns. So to ease us into this lecture, I want to start by playing a song that perhaps if you don't know the words, you will know the melody to, just to demonstrate in a way how Burns's work continues to be remediated and is probably in the collective memory of us all in some sense. That was, of course, Burns's lament on times past and old friendships parted at Auld Lang Syne, which I'm sure you're familiar with through it being played at New Year in various locations around the world, and of course at New York during the Times Square ball drop. And in fact, Stephen Winnick, who's here today from the American Folklife Centre, has written an excellent blog on Auld Lang Syne, which I recommend looking up for more context. I partly played it though because there is a much neglected verse of Burns's Auld Lang Syne that I think helps to frame part of my book project as a whole. In verses 3 and 4, Burns' speaker, lamenting on a lost friendship separated by time, space, and geophysical separation, states, "We twa hae pedalled in the burn frae morning sun till dine, but seas between us braid hae roared since auld lang syne." So here, Burns' speaker talks of how seas between us broad have roared. There's a broad sea roaring between themselves and the friend, and that sea, of course, being the Atlantic Ocean. And this is a good reminder for me in one of Burns' most popular songs that Burns lived in and responded to what Laura Doyle calls a transnational world of encounters on the Atlantic periphery. It was not just people that moved back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, it was songs, poetry, objects, political thought, the list goes on. So in many ways, what that verse is a microcosm of is that Burns lived in and responded to a transnational world, and it's part of my project to reconsider Burns as a transnational poet in the context of the United States of America. I do this partly because for much of the 20th century, Burns was often considered a poet of limited linguistic range and geographical significance. He was often considered a backwards dialect poet who only really had significance within the borders of Scotland. His international significance, his literary devices, his broader oeuvre was not really appreciated or recognised critically out with the borders of Scotland. So I'm following on from some peers and scholars and superiors, mainly at the University of Glasgow, who have taken to reconsidering Burns in a transnational context. And I'm doing so in the context of the United States specifically. So my broader book project looks at the reception, the literary influence, and the cultural memory of Burns in 19th century America. And it's the cultural memory aspect that I want to focus on for the remainder of the lecture today. Before I do so, I want to say something very briefly about how the memory of Burns and the legacy of Burns continues to be very contested. Arguably more so than any other British or even worldwide 18th century literary figure, the popular legacy of Burns constantly straddles these boundaries between history, memory, and myth. And this often plays out in the political arena. So, to give you an example, the memory of Burns during the 2014 Scottish independence referendum was continually squabbled over. You had the Yes campaign on one hand, who maintained that Burns would have voted for an independent Scotland. And meanwhile, you also had the No campaign, who tried to appropriate him and his works into their arguments. Now, this was, of course, a highly speculative and at times tedious debate. And I think it's summed up well by this poetic flighting between the former UK Prime Minister David Cameron and the former First Minister of Scotland, Alex Salmond.
Finally, there's been another argument on Scottish questions today, a rather more linguistic one. A Prime Minister's questions, David Cameron tipped his hand to tonight's Burns Night celebrations, borrowing from the bar when asked about Scotland leaving the Union.
And when I hear the Scottish nationalists, who are so keen to leave the United Kingdom, yet so anxious about having a referendum, perhaps they should remember Burns' words, which he referred to the "we, sleek-it, cowering, timorous beastie, oh, what a panic, midnight breastie."
Well, on hearing the Prime Minister's rendition of two of those, Alex Salmond offered to give him elocution lessons on Scots pronunciation. Here's apparently how it should have sounded. We sleek-it, cowering, timorous beastie, oh, what a panic, midnight breastie.
So though this is definitely comic, it still illustrates the continuing symbolic power of Burns and his works, in that these two widely divergent politicians and parties felt it necessary to somehow enlist him and his works into their arguments in order to persuade their votership. And in fact, a similar thing happened the following year during the 2015 UK general election. there were voting booths in Scotland for the Scottish branch of the United Kingdom Independence Party, UKIP, a right-wing populist party, that had lines from Burns's Dumfries Volunteers emblazoned on it. Meanwhile, the opposing Scottish Nationalist Party had launched their campaign on his birthday. So once again, a repeat of the 2014 referendum. There's a tug of war, if you like, between the legacy of Burns. Now, to flip back to the 19th century United States, the memory of Burns was equally contested, multiflorous, and complex. The idea that Burns's rise to popularity in 19th century America was because he was a Republican poet and a friend to liberty has been both popular and enduring, partly due to the frequency with which he has been yoked with ideological praise from influential Americans such as Walt Whitman, Emerson, and Abraham Lincoln. Walt Whitman says of Burns in 1888, for example, quote, "There are many things in Burns's poems and character that specially endear him to America. He was essentially a Republican, would have been at home in the Western United States, and probably become eminent there." While in a written memoranda on Robert Burns, Abraham Lincoln remarked, quote, "I cannot frame a toast to Burns. I can say nothing worthy of his generous heart and transcendent genius." However, groups and individuals as divergent as Frederick Douglass and even the Ku Klux Klan, among many others, also held their own very idiosyncratic 19th century memories of Burns that were simultaneously articulated through speeches, essays, dinners, and other forms of objectified culture. Regularly implicit in these articulations of remembrance, however, was the subjective promotion of group and individual values. Where Frederick Douglass remembered Burns as being kin to an African-American slave who had, quote, "broke loose from the moorings which society had thrown around him," the first Ku Klux Klan used the recitation of Burns's To a Louse as a rite of initiation, and incorporated other elements of his poetry into their founding constitutional document. Now, these examples are obviously very polarizing and powerful, and admittedly require much further context and analysis, which I will go into. But nonetheless, pointing out such deviations in literary appropriation and memory unquestionably renders Burns a worthy subject when discussing the complex interrelationships between memory, history, and identity. To help us make sense of the layered and complex commemoration of Burns in the 19th century, then, I'd like to turn to some theory with specific regards to the term cultural memory. Employed and appropriated across disciplines as diverse as literature, neuroscience, and philosophy, the term cultural memory has become academically convoluted in recent years. In literary studies, it often refers to how memory, or knowledge about past events, authors, events, people, or things, are preserved through cultural means in any given space or place. In referring to the cultural memory of Burns in the US, then, one might think of the term as an umbrella for considering the ways in which American society, through festivals, songs, ritual, texts, biographies, rites, or otherwise, remembered the poet and his works. This use of the term broadly derives from a reinvigorated interest in and response to Maurice Halbwach's 20th century concept of collective memory, or mémoire collective. Formulated in the same period that Freud famously began to introduce memory theory through metapsychology, Halbwach challenged Freud's view of memory being a resource of the individual psyche, arguing that it operates according to social rather than a psychological dynamic. Halbwach suggested that perceptions of the past or people are continually revised by social forces that act upon us and moderate our present conceptions of any given object or person. The dynamics of social structures, families, demographics, social classes, and religious sects, for example, determine the ways in which we remember the past, creating a shared memory and a shared identity that might differ from the collective memory of other groups. And it's this idea that led Halbach to distinguish between what he felt was memory and history, where history, or historical knowledge about the past, is a set of generalized facts that follow some sort of fixed standardization, say, for example, the birth and the death dates of Burns. Collective memory contains a subjective dimension and promotes a sense of identity which is intimately tied to a particular group and its value, which, when you frame it in this context, might explain why different groups and individuals within 19th century America would remember Burns in widely divergent ways. Expanding on Maurice Halbach's model, Jan Assmann has put forth the idea that collective memory might be split into two further interrelated categories: communicative memory, which is based on everyday oral communication, and cultural memory, which forms when living communication crystallizes in the form of objectified culture. In other words, where communicative memory is articulated by active participants, cultural memory relies on symbolization and requires what he calls institutions of preservation, such as relics, books, statues, and other modes of objectification. Now, admittedly, the incisive categorical tagging here of communicative memory being primarily transmitted through oral means and cultural memory as stemming from objectified culture can be misleading, partly due to the fact that cultural memory can also be preserved or inscribed orally. So where, say, biographies and statues of Burns in 19th century America might be the more obvious examples of what we would call cultural memory, in that they were obviously objectified, it's also important to consider historically significant oral accounts. An example of this might be to think of Ralph Waldo Emerson's orally transmitted 1859 speech on the centenary of Burns's birth. Despite frequently referring to his memory of Burns, it was not, as would be the case for a communicative memory, a living autobiographical embodied memory. He did not know Burns or have a first-hand account of the poet. Instead, Emerson's memory was shaped by existing institutions of preservation, such as the centenary itself, the Boston Burns Club, or biographical texts on Burns. And this comes through in the way that Emerson describes Burns as being kin to the armed and privileged minorities who worked politically in the American Revolution. Here, Emerson's individual memory clearly reflects the influence of wider social structures, namely ideologically tinted biographies that had depicted Burns as a revolutionary, and the Boston Burns Club, which prided itself on political idealism, particularly with regards to the recently formed Republican Party of the 1850s. Though Burns did make references towards the outcome of the American Revolution in some of his poems, the manner in which he's fervently remembered and likened to American revolutionaries at the Parker House Hotel clearly smacks of a memory source being remodified into an idealized image, which is directly in line with Halbach's theory. Moreover, though Emerson's memory was orally transmitted, its ceremonial communication at the Parker House Hotel effectively formed another institution of preservation, in that his speech was to be remembered, transcribed, and disseminated widely for generations to come, to the point where we sit here, or I stand here, talking about it today. Perhaps the most striking competition over the memory of Burns in the 19th century was between African-American abolitionist Frederick Douglass and opposing groups and individuals from the slaveholding states of the American South. There's been a recent surge of interest in the speeches that Douglass delivered in Scotland during his anti-slavery tour of Britain and Ireland in the 1840s, primarily due to the continuing scholarly attempts to recover the memory of Scottish connections with slavery and the Black Atlantic. It was during this tour that Douglass visited the birthplace of Burns in 1846 and wrote an essay titled "A Fugitive Slave Visiting the Birthplace of Robert Burns." A fuller examination of Douglass's account reveals the extent to which his individual memory was shaped by socio-political tensions, and in particular abolitionist discourses. It would be a stretch, or even an injustice, to suggest that Douglass systematically constructed his written memory of Burns to bolster white Scottish support for the movement. Douglass was long acquainted with Burns's poetry, having purchased the 1833 Philadelphia edition as his first book after his escape from slavery, and he later gifted it to his son as a keepsake over 3 decades later in 1867. Yet the rhetorical and thematic parallels between a fugitive slave visiting the birthplace of Burns and his contemporary oratory proclamations in 1846 still serve to highlight a distinct correlation between Douglass's individual memory and the social discourses that surrounded him. To drive home the point, it's worth juxtaposing a speech Douglass gave in Paisley with his account of Burns. Where Douglass describes Burns as being trapped in, quote, the moorings which society had thrown around him, African Americans were described in Paisley as, quote, clanking their chains and calling upon Britons to aid them. Where Burns lived, quote, in the midst of a bigoted and besotted clergy, the Paisley speech condemned the bigotry of a church that, quote, comes forward and holds up the slaveholder as being Christian. Douglass's description of how Burns battled a corrupt generation plagued by, quote, a shallow-brained aristocracy also resonates with his protests in Paisley against, quote, the man whose pockets are lined with the gold with which I ought to have been educated. The theme of pious hypocrisy is also implicit throughout. Acknowledging the poet's alleged misgivings, Douglass maintained that Burns was, quote, yet more faultless than many who have come down to us in the pages of history as saints. In a similar condemnation in Paisley, he remarked, quote, the Free Church is doing more for infidelity and atheism than all the infidels in Scotland combined. Douglass's targeted attack on the Free Church of Scotland, founded in 1843 after the Great Disruption, was the result of Free Church of Scotland missionaries accepting monetary donations from American slaveholders in order to basically develop the church and develop the congregation. This partly inspired Douglass's tour of Scotland, which became known as the Send the Money Back campaign, which, when taking a moment to reflect on that, it was truly an incredible act of transatlantic humanitarian activism on the part of Frederick Douglass. In order to acquire the fullest understanding of the social discourses that shaped Douglass's memory of Burns then, it's crucial to acknowledge that his written account was composed at the height of his mission to exert pressure on the United States by increasing international sympathy and support for abolition, and condemning the slave-based economy, which was continuing to benefit the Free Church of Scotland. These ardent concerns and social-political factors permeate his memory of Burns, as the poet is symbolically enlisted into Douglass's powerful discourse on slavery and abolition. Now, the posthumous use of Burns by Douglass and other prominent 19th century abolitionists remains an uncomfortable topic given the poet's increasingly debated and somewhat ambiguous attitudes towards slavery and abolition. Burns, after all, had signed up to sail to Jamaica prior to the success of his first volume of poetry, and he certainly cannot be counted among the most prominent 18th century abolitionists in Scotland. Indeed, there is an uncomfortable conflict between a man whose poetry is predominantly egalitarian and humanitarian in nature, and yet who also seems to refrain from any abolitionist discourse and had proposed to undertake a job as a bookkeeper on a Jamaican plantation. Yet the wider discussion of Burns and slavery and abolition itself reveals much about the selective dynamics of cultural memory and collective remembrance. That the reprinting of Douglass's letter functioned and continues to function as an institution of preservation is clear in that it's influenced several subsequent transatlantic constructions of the poet. Maya Angelou, for example, also made a pilgrimage to Burns country and identified the poet as the first white man who, quote, understood that a human being was a human being and we are more alike than unalike. Even in the 21st century, we might then view, for example, Kofi Annan's enlistment of Burns into a global canon of humanitarianism with renewed interest. Speaking in 2004 at the United Nations headquarters in New York, Annan described Burns as, quote, an opponent of slavery, pomposity, and greed. Rather than doggedly attempt to defend, condemn, or verify such a statement, it might serve us well in terms of historical understanding of working memories to consider more fully the cultural mechanisms at work by the ongoing remediation and construction of these memories. To further illustrate the selective dynamics of cultural memory in 19th century America, we might turn to explore an opposing and indeed far less palatable form of commemoration in Pulaski, Tennessee, 1865. In a ceremonial induction for potential members of the newly formed white supremacist fraternity, the Ku Klux Klan, Burns's Tualaus was incorporated as a rite of initiation. The Klan historian Martin Gitlin has described the process, quote, a skullcap with donkey's ears sewn on it was placed on the head of a candidate, who was then escorted to a large dressing mirror the Klan dubbed as the Royal Altar, and ordered to recite a poem by Scotsman Robert Burns. The blindfold was then removed to reveal to the candidate that he'd literally been dressed up as an ass, much to the amusement of the Klansmen. The embarrassed man could then accept or deny membership. Most agreed to join with those in the financially depressed rural areas showing a particular interest. In addition to this, the first constitutional document of the Ku Klux Klan also reveals a Burnsian influence. Printed secretly in the office of the Pulaski Citizen in 1867, the prescript begins with two unattributed literary quotes, one from Shakespeare's Hamlet, along with an altered stanza from Burns's address to the Deal. In the verse you can see there, Burns's original use of Bardy's rantin' drinkin' is replaced with ghoul to denote the white-cloaked members of the organization who, as outlined in the document, were to meet in dens under the command of the Grand Wizard of the Empire. In addition to the dark, haunting connotations of an inebriated, ranting ghoul, it's likely that the stanza was also chosen for its degenerative reference to a black pit. Now, the question of why Burns's poetry was adopted by vengeful Confederate veterans intent on venting their frustrations on African Americans merits further discussion, particularly when juxtaposed with the simultaneous use of Burns's work in abolitionist discourses of the period. On one hand, the first Ku Klux Klan initiation ceremony might be viewed as mere comical farce in its primary purpose of entertaining existing members of the organization. In this view, Burns and his poem may not have been considered as holding any major thematic or political significance in relation to white supremacist ideals. The recitation of the lines, "O wouldst empower the gift to gie us, to see ourselves as others see us," complied with the prank, which culminated in the potential new member finally seeing himself humiliated in a large dressing mirror as others did, dressed up as an ass. Yet wholly reducing the Ku Klux Klan rite to mere farce would be ignorant of both the constitutional use of address to the Deal and, more broadly, the extent to which Scottish writers, imagery, and iconography played a part in shaping the identity of Southern extremists. There is much evidence to suggest that ex-Confederate soldiers drew on parallels between the loss of Highland culture in 18th century Scotland and the loss of Southern independence after the Civil War. This formed a mold for the foundational identity of various Southern far-right groups, such as the League of the South, the John Birch Society, and the Anti-Semitic Christian Identity, all of whom drew on selective interpretations of Scottish or Celtic history to justify their defense of what they saw as their threatened white Anglo-Celtic culture. Anne Rigney states that one of the ways emergent groups confirm their identity as a group is by celebrating and reinforcing their sense of a common past or a memory. Rigney goes further to suggest that the sense of sharing memories or of having a past in common is arguably a precondition for the emergence of such groups in the first place. Taken as an emergent group formed after the ashes of the Civil War, then, we might see why the 6 founding members of the Ku Klux Klan would draw upon their perceived sense of shared Scots Presbyterian heritage. The Klan's appropriation and memory of Burns, then, was clearly embedded within a much wider Southern tradition, fully developing after the Civil War, of drawing on Scottish iconography to articulate and maintain a distinctly white identity, thus implicitly drawing out the connections between literary commemoration and national or civic identity. To edge towards a conclusion on this talk, I'd like to consider the complex issue of whether these widely divergent modes of remembrance and reappropriation might legitimately be grouped together and viewed as instances of national cultural remembrance unique to 19th century America. Studies on cultures of national remembrance have continued to boom in recent decades, partly catalyzed by a rejuvenated sense of engagement with Pierre Nora's monumental 7-work volume, Les Loups de Mémoire. Nora pointed to how, as a byproduct of modernization, national feeling is actively cultivated and maintained through forms of objectified culture. For Nora, by the 19th century, national memories of the past could no longer be orally communicated through spontaneous or lived experience. Consequently, Nora argued, national communities had to construct and draw upon forms of objectified culture, or rather loups de mémoire, which translates as sites or realms of memory, in order to establish and maintain meaningful relationships with the past and harmonize collective feeling. These loups or sites might range from ceremonies, statues, museums, anniversaries, flags, buildings, to outstanding literary individuals, with the binding principle that they, whether physically or spiritually, uphold shared memories of the past that serve to form group or national identity. Now, Alex Tyrrell has suggested that in 19th century Scotland, Burns had become what Nora calls a loup de mémoire, in that the public celebration and commemoration of the poet helped to give Scots a notion of the past and shaped forms of Scottish national identity. Burns essentially became a symbolic figure, and his work became symbolic in cementing national feeling. However, the issue of Burns functioning as a loup de mémoire for Scotland in the US is far more complex and problematic. On one hand, we must acknowledge how Burns and his works helped to cement and articulate the identity of expatriate Scots in America and their descendants. From the early 1800s onwards, expatriate Scots attended St. Andrew's Society dinners to toast the poet and their country. Local poets preserved and adapted Scots language verse and songs inspired by Burns, and tartan or other Scottish imagery was often adorned commemorative events for Burns. And in fact, we do have a couple of members from the DC St. Andrew's Society here today, thanks to my friend Brian. To another extreme, though, the prevalence of American flags at the 1859 Burns centenary, toast to the president, and assertions that Burns fought for freedom and American liberty might even suggest a rather fragile case for him representing a loup de mémoire for 19th century American national identity. However, as my talk today has illustrated, 19th century American national identity was hardly uniform and comprised of a plurality of forms. The idea of Burns as a figurative loup de mémoire in the context of the 19th century US is problematic in that we might identify within one nation multiple and at times competing layers of memory. The most obvious example of this being, of course, the simultaneous appropriation of the poet by both northern abolitionists and southern secessionists. The 19th century cultural memory of Burns, then, was fluid, repeatedly reshaped, and reflective of multiple national and civic identities. And accordingly, I'd like to finish by looking at some developments in the field of memory studies to try to frame this a little better and tie it up. The Yale historian and memory theorist J.M. Winter has argued that we must adopt a more dynamic approach to cultures of remembrance and to the interpretation of Nora's theory in transnational contexts. In developing a wider vocabulary for a transnational age, Winter has introduced the conceptual term palimpsest, connoting a repeated overlay of memories that transmit variable messages but are bound together by an original source. Thus, conceiving of memory sites, in this case Burns, as palimpsests is more appropriately fluid than retorting to more rigid, inflexible terms or metaphors that fail to reflect on the layered, multidimensional nature of cultural memory in transnational contexts. Consequently, returning to the cultural memory of Burns through the lens of Winter's metaphor is a useful exercise. It's clear from my examples today that it's near impossible to find one shared or national story or appreciation or appropriation when unpacking the poet as a multidimensional site of memory in the US. Yet equally, these multidimensional memories and remediations should not be considered as entirely separated or isolated acts, given they stem from the same memory source, espouse various conceptions of both the American and the Scottish nation, and are bound together by specific geochronological parameters. Consider then the multiple modes and divergent forms of commemoration outlined today as forming a palimpsest, replete with visible but overwritten layers of memory. Today's discussion has, of course, merely touched upon a small portion of these palimpsestuous memories. As the centuries progressed and continue to progress, new inscriptions would add further layers to the Burnsian palimpsest, such as the continuing erection of statues, adoption and appropriation of songs, or widely publicized commentaries by notable figures, which were to be reproduced and continue to be reproduced. Pertaining to Winter's sense of a palimpsest being reused or altered, but not erasing earlier inscriptions, these instances of commemoration allowed for a diversity of interpretations that underlined simultaneous polyphonic meanings. Consistently, this Burnsian palimpsest, This Burnsian palimpsest, in accordance with the fluid nature of transnational sites of memory, variously preserves contested narratives, divergent ideologies, plural identities, multiple appropriations, and contradictory national histories, whilst all the while retaining a trace of the original memory source, Robert Burns and his works. And since I started today with one familiar musical clip inscribed, I think, onto the collective memory of us all, I'd like to finish by playing out another very famous melody. Perhaps one of his most famous songs is There for Honest Poverty. Now, this song was, in fact, the song which Frederick Douglass and other prominent abolitionists of the 19th century drew upon, including Henry Ward Beecher and William Lloyd Garrison. Quoting lyrics from the song, Douglass declared in a newspaper article in the National Anti-Slavery Standard that, quote, regardless of complexion, a man's a man for all that, here evoking Burns's most egalitarian of refrains. So here is an instrumental version of the song played by my friend Sean Healy, who I almost roped in to come and play for us live today, but a mix-up in circumstance means we'll have to make do with a recording. This is A Man's a Man for All That, followed by the real Journey to Glencoe, and we can call this the final inscription onto the Burnsian palimpsest before I take some questions today. a wee sleek at Bloggy.
I want to mention one thing. I love that you had that Alan Salmon clip in there with him, debating with David Cameron. As you know, Alan Salmon came here to the library and spoke about Robert Burns at length, and that is in a webcast that's online at the American Folk Center's Robert Burns Symposium. I think it was 2009. So people can look for that. He's actually quite learned in his knowledge of Robert Burns. So you don't want to tangle him. That was a tactical error on Cameron's part. But I love your mention of palimpsests and the idea of American abolitionists and also Maya Angelou, particularly drawn on a man-to-man for all that. And in particular, she said he was the first white man to recognize that a human being is a human being, which is already forgiving Burns's gender specificity, because what he actually said was a man-to-man, of course. But beyond that, within that poem, there is, of course, the phrase, the coward slave passing by. And it speaks to this question of Burns's approach and attitude towards slavery, because he has this sort of metaphorical term slave that he uses to mean a no-account coward, and then he has people who are actually enslaved that he has as characters in his poem, such as the slaves and men, where he obviously has a lot of sympathy. And so the question I have is, you see that tension even in his use of the word slave, and the question is, what are we to make of his attitude to slavery, which to me almost seems like he personally disapproved of it, but not enough to do anything about it, which opens the question of, is he a coward slave in his own, by his own definition? So what do you think of that, his attitude toward the institution of slavery?
Yeah, I mean, in Burns studies, it's almost $1 million question. There's several essays that say one thing or another. I think you touch on it there with, it's almost a complacency on his part. I think that what you can gather from his work and his letters is that you're dealing with a highly sensitive, empathetic individual who, whether it's humans or animals, tends to stand up against abuse and oppression. Why doesn't that extend to slavery in 18th century Scotland? Not in 18th century Scotland, but the mechanism of slavery abroad, when you had abolitionist groups in Scotland forming and very active, and he doesn't appear on any of their lists or their societies or their meetings. And then you have, as you say, the problematic mention of the coward slave in A Man's a Man. And there's actually another reference in poems chiefly in the Scottish dialect that refers to the buckskin kye, meaning black cattle, which is also problematic. As for the slave's lament, which you kind of say there is a counterpoint to that, a very empathetic, a very sympathetic way of looking at an individual who's been torn from the shores of Senegal to the bitter, frosty, snowy lands of Virginia. That's actually problematic in itself, because there's a lot of talk among scholars that Burns didn't actually write that. And I mean, you of all people, I'd be curious to know where you get with this, given your skills. But for there's an upcoming Oxford edition of Burns's poetry, and I think that there'll be a lot of work going into trying to establish whether or not, or who else could have possibly written the Slave's Lament. But the consensus at the moment is that he didn't actually write that. So, in short, your question, what do I think his attitudes towards slavery was, I think is a very difficult question, because I don't think that there's enough, if there was enough evidence to say one way or another, then it would have been established. And I think it gets into realms of speculation a lot, but I do think that, yeah, I mean, my former PI, Gerard Carruthers, hit a note with me once where he sort of said, well, it kind of made me think about the causes and the sufferings that happen in the 21st century that don't happen in front of us, but we turn a blind eye to anyway, and not everyone gets involved in activism. Not everyone gets involved in activism towards, say, chemical attacks or war, or, you know, we continue with our life and we continue what we're doing because it's not right in front of us. We don't see the suffering in front of us. So Is it a case where it was, had he been confronted with it, had he have sailed to Jamaica, he would have been empathetic? I think he probably would be, because he's such an empathetic person on so many other levels. But can you say for sure? I don't think you can. I don't know is the question, is the answer, yeah. I can direct you to a few essays that debate the issue well, and also the reference to the coward slave in A Man's a Man. So Murray Pittock has an essay on that, where he, as you say, says it's not the slave in the context that we think of an African-American slave. It's a cowardly form of language. You have to look at the semantic meaning of that in the context of late 18th century Scotland. So it kind of pulls up all these things, and I'll forward them on to you if it helps.
Thanks very much for that. That was fascinating stuff. I'm really interested in this idea that you've tapped on throughout, which is really interesting at the moment with the whole question about how nationalism is being appropriated at the current time, but particularly with regards to the sort of traditions of the Klux Klan and the ideas that they were seeking to sort of center themselves within some sort of Celtic, Scottish, maybe some sort of lineage of cultural sympathy with them to develop this new national identity. I'm wondering two questions about that. The first is, how fully developed do you think that sort of an idea was? I was almost hoping to maybe hear a little bit more, because it sounds absolutely fascinating, particularly the sort of ritualistic elements, how much they were tied into it. I mean, the donkey's ears almost sound like they're undermining the idea of using Burns himself. They're almost mocking the Burns citation as well by doing that. And so the other thing that I was wondering was, were other fraternal orders, fraternal lodges also using Burns in their ritualistic sort of indoctrination? Yes, rituals.
I mean, certainly, so to answer your second question first, like certainly the short answer there would be Freemasons in both Scotland and America use and appropriate Burns and herald him as a great Mason, and use him to cement their own sense of identity and their sense of fraternity with a very rich history, to the point where there's a huge Burns collection still in the William R. Smith collection here in DC, in the Scottish Rite Masonic Temple. The question, like, how fleshed out was drawing on iconography? Do you mean like drawing on Burns or Scottish iconography more broadly?
The way that you were describing it to us was the way that they were almost intertwined, that this was developing upon that.
You mean like developing from a Scottish iconography point of view? Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it does develop, and I think it continues to. Because if you look, not necessarily Burns, but certainly Scottish and Celtic symbolization and imagery. Because even like during the Second Klan, when they adopt the burning cross motive, that's from a Walter Scott novel, The Lady of the Lake poem, sorry. And Scott in particular, his novels of sort of the Romantic Highlander and the Secessionist were very much drawn upon by people who were bitter by what happened after the effects of the Civil War. Past the Second Klan, I briefly mentioned that there you have the likes of the League of the South, which in its original incarnation was almost an intellectual movement that tried to establish that the South was somehow different because of its Anglo-Celtic heritage. And so things like the Celtic cross was adopted. It was considered ethnically different through Anglo-Celtic connections. So the Klan initiation ceremony, I see what you mean by it almost undermines Burns's poem, but I think there's a definite link there between the fact that the majority of these individuals were from Scots Presbyterian descent, and so had, as I was saying about emergent identities, had a common point of a past there, if that makes sense.
Burns, the historical figure, and Burns, the sort of ideological appropriation, not in your work, because I think it's clear how you're using it, but for the people who are appropriating it, to what extent does it matter to any given any given abolitionist or to any given Klan member, what Burns himself might have said, and how much is Burns's work becoming a symbol that, you know, that is dissociated in the minds of people using it
Yeah.
from the historical actor?
Yeah, it's a good question. To what extent does it matter? I don't think it should matter if you're aware of it. If you're conscious of the fact that your appropriation and your version or what you're taking from a symbol or their works is derivative of something constructed that informs your own identity, but not necessarily historical gospel, then I don't think there is any problem.
Well,
But
I'm not asking whether it's a problematic move so much as I'm asking whether people are, as they're mobilizing an interpretation, whether what they're doing is trying to interpret a historical figure, right? So, like, to use a different example from American history, the founders intended blah, blah, blah when they wrote thus and such into the Constitution, versus the Constitution as a document separated from the founders can be marshaled for this purpose or that purpose, right?
Okay.
So does the Klan care about Burns, or do they care about what they're using Burns for?
Yeah, I think that I think they care about him enough to print a verse on the first founding prescript of the star, or asterisk it's called. I think that they are familiar enough with him and his works to appropriate it. To what extent are they aware of the historical nuances? I think it's a good question, and I think that more actually needs to be done on that in terms of flicking through all the pages of the Pulaski Citizen at the time and getting some sense of identity of how much they actually cared about it. I'm working on a upcoming project on Scotland in the South that I hope to do more of that kind of work. Does that help answer it at all?
That's great.
Thank you. Thanks.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.